Let's talk about superpower. It's fascinating to me that this movie, as a much lighter film that you wanted to make about this extraordinary story of a guy who was an actor, a comedic actor predominantly. He'd been seen playing the piano with his penis on a special on TV for the delectation of Ukrainian people, and they all laughed. Then he takes part in this series called Servant of the People, where, as a comedic actor, he ends up becoming president of Ukraine.
Right.
And we got a clip.
Знаешь, оказалось, быть президентом не так просто. Есть всякие плохие, вредные деньги, которые постоянно мешают твоей стране.
А у тебя есть суперсила?
Конечно, есть. Ты. Ты моя суперсила. Мы будем с тобой встречаться. Ты меня будешь заряжать энергией. Вот так. И я буду бороться с плохими дядьками. Договорились?
Да.
Спи.
Спокойной ночи.
Обещаешь не драться?
Чуть-чуть.
Спи.
Such a powerful clip, that, because it's so prescient. Yeah. Because this guy then becomes the real president of Ukraine, and very quickly has a very bad guy and other bad guys coming to take his country. Yeah. In that moment, your whole film that you've been making, which is a light, fun look at a guy who's a comedy actor, and you're an actor, and you think, this is fun. And then it gets incredibly serious. And you as a filmmaker, for you as an actor, what did you make of all this?
Well, personally, it's one more time where I could say, I try to be light and then pull me back in. We really
it's
did.
Like Al Pacino in Godfather 3. Suck me back in.
Yeah. It's interesting. I take it back a little bit to when we were talking about President Biden. This is somebody who has been an extraordinary person of service for so long, understands the game very deeply, the process, the bureaucratic process, and I think has a lot to offer. This situation was so, we met President Zelensky the first time. I had said, because of what I thought could be a value-added documentary that I could make versus some accomplished documentarian or journalist, that it's always been a kind of a trust and trustworthiness bond, and maybe it would be a different kind of conversation. And therefore I didn't want to have a camera available the first time we met face to face. And it was just a crazy coincidence of timing that we met the first time on the 23rd without a camera.
Literally the day before the war starts.
Right, and agreed that on the 24th, we'd do our first session with the camera.
And unbelievably, he sees you.
He fulfilled the commitment despite the rockets coming in.
We've got a clip of this.
Yeah. So here our new home.
Where does it end? I mean, what does he want?
He wants us to be dead. He hates Ukraine. He hates us, and we don't know why.
I mean, it's incredible. The war starts and he takes time to see you. And no offense, but Sean Penn, you're an actor. Yeah. Were you surprised he kept that meeting? And why do you think he did?
I was surprised. Of course I was surprised. We were all processing the tragedy of this unimaginable decision of Putin's. Today I understand it better. I think he's very savvy. I think that any opportunity to have a record of, I think he believed in what he was going to do and what his people were going to do. So much so that in a country at war, we were never watched over when we were shooting. We never had a minder. There was never a word of influencing anything.
Really? He knew how important America would be, and he thought using a Hollywood superstar, multiple Oscar winner, would shine a light right when he needed it to get help from America. That's a guy who understands the media, understands politics, possibly from playing a president in a comedy. I mean, it's surreal the way you guys came together like this.
Yeah, and another way to look at it is, whenever I've been very focused and had a lot of responsibility, I'm not comparing it to the responsibility he has, but I've had responsibilities in certain situations to a lot of people and sometimes to their physical well-being. And, you do find that moment where your bandwidth needs to step outside and have a cigarette. It may be that, he used this opportunity. Obviously, he stepped outside and essentially had a cigarette.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it's like he took time out of fighting a war.
He was also, Sean, at the time, on that day, the #1 target in the country for Putin. It was a moment when you go to the front line. This is about 4 months later. And a woman says this to you.
It's about 10 kilometers from zero position.
That's the priority.
Can I be very blunt? You're Sean Penn. Nobody's going to be responsible for you dying on the front line.
I mean, that's a moment when you hear that, because that's completely true. The front line doesn't care who you are or how many Oscars you've won. You end up 150 meters away from Russians across a river. Notwithstanding, you've been in a few hairy situations in your life. That must have been a seriously unnerving moment, wasn't it?
Of course, I took a deep breath at some point before we went in, but I also felt that, and what's here, I think quite graciously, that voice who was working as a translator with us, she offered an abundance of caution. But again, it's almost an embarrassing thing I understand the question, and there's some versions of this I could say differently, but when I think of people who are staying there in that fight, versus parachuting in for a second and getting a little bit of a story and going out, I don't really know how to talk about that.
There's a moment when you go to an apartment block. This is in your first visit after the war started in June, and you see the devastation for yourself of an airstrike that had happened just a few hours before. And what was particularly telling for me as I watched you do this was I suddenly realized that this was the same apartment block I'd gone to a month after you when I did a show or 2 shows from Kyiv and walked in, I'm pretty sure, the same apartment block. And I don't know how you felt but I felt I'd never been in that kind of, I'm not a war correspondent. I don't normally go to places like this. And just to see the utter devastation of just, in that case, one person's life. Yeah. It's not just frontline soldier to soldier. No. It is the constant barrage of civilian life and ordinary people's lives.
It's all the families that have been separated for 2 years while the men stay to fight the fight or support the fight in country, and the mothers and the children who are spread out all over the world, some with no promise of anywhere, anything to go, or any support, and in some cases getting otherworldly support. Poland in particular was, both the civilians and the leadership were extraordinary toward them. But still, that's walking out into a brave new world and just worrying every day about your brother or your father, or your son who's in the fight.
You dedicate the film to a Ukrainian fighter pilot known as Juice. He was the leader of the fabled Ghost of Kiev unit, which didn't actually exist in the way people thought, but he was an unbelievably good pilot, and he very sadly died 3 months ago in a training exercise. You see in the movie, you take him to see Top Gun Maverick. He's a real-life Top Gun. You saw it in Washington when you were lobbying for F-16 jets. And he's now one of the 100,000 Ukrainians who died in this war, including, I think, 13,000 civilians. Tell me about him for a moment. I mean, the impact he had on your life.
Well, I'd like to say we became friends. We kept in touch after we spent time in Washington. I might, we'd be on an encrypted line that he was okay with, and I might, say, hey, what's happening? He said, just about to go wheels up, and he'd be, because they were constantly in the fight. He was a very poetic creature, not what you would expect of a Top Gun, essentially Top Gun fighter pilot. He was a great leader. He's a guy who believed he owed his country service. He was a Yeah, sort of personality-wise, the furthest thing you'd think from a military man, and a beautiful spirit and great humor. Most people know that movie, Top Gun Maverick, and when we were watching it in D.C., I was sitting next to him, and he leaned over at one point after Tom Cruise had ejected, and found his way in his dusty flight suit to the diner, and he leaned over and he said, "That's why I always take my wallet."
How did you find out that he died?
So, somebody I don't know. I mean, if he would mind my saying his name, you can assume who it is from. Let's say the civilian now, someone who had worked in government, who would have known anything the New York Times knew by the time the New York Times knew it. Anything where you collect open source material. And a very credible person called me middle of the night and said, no, because I'd introduced the two of them in D.C. and knew that I would want to know, and said this happened. And then I double checked it with the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, and they came back and said, yeah.
Sad moment for you.
Yeah.
Well,
but sort of like what you're talking about with the apartment, right? It's personalized.
Yeah.
And it's personalized tens of thousands of times.